You thought the apocalypse was going to look like nuclear fallout or zombies chasing you down the street. But nope. Forget the worst-case scenarios we all dread. Instead, we're diving into the much scarier world of human decency, the realm where Good Samaritans crawl out of the woodwork like overly enthusiastic vigilantes brandishing kindness instead of justice. Welcome to The Good Samaritan, a gentle lesson in kindness, a documentary that's less about saving lives and more about figuring out if love for one's neighbor can survive an eternity of angry tweets and reality TV. Spoiler alert, turns out it can. We're pulling back the curtain on some of history's most bewildering tales of compassion. From the time a band of medieval knights decided that helping their enemies was a good idea. Clearly, they had some better PR in mind, to tales of people in dire situations who, against their better judgment, went above and beyond, often with laughably ironic outcomes. Picture it. A miserable day in ancient Rome. A man twists his ankle while helping a stranger. What does he get in return? A lecture on dramatic irony as the ambassador of the compassion from above plans to slap him with a guilt trip. Ah, sweet kindness. And then there's our protagonist, Mr. Samaritan, who finds himself enmeshed in unexpected dilemmas where tearing down walls of indifference seems more challenging than building them, proving that maybe altruism isn't just a feel-good mantra, but rather like trying to assemble IKEA furniture with instructions in Aramaic. So buckle up as we venture through whimsical narratives of oddball altruism, equal parts absurd and uplifting, reminding us that compassion for fellow humans comes with its fair share of mishaps, misunderstandings, and a healthy dose of humor. Get ready to discover that kindness could be the most confusing pastime of all. Because, after all, who knew helping others could be so complicated? It's a bizarre world out there, folks, and while we often reach for the remote to change the channel on our troubles, eccentric stories of unlikely heroes teach us that sometimes, just sometimes, lending a hand might make us more of a hot mess than a hologram of virtue. But isn't that truly the point? Get ready. It's time for a joyful jaunt into the chaotic, candy-colored universe of compassion, where love for strangers is only slightly more realistic than finding a unicorn in your backyard. Imagine the year 1492. A dimly lit village feast in a medieval English hall scented with the pungent aroma of sweaty tunics and freshly crushed garlic cloves. The wooden benches creak under the weight of uneasy nobles and jittery peasants alike. Tonight's entertainment, a grand banquet featuring the humble yet divisive centerpiece, a monstrous plate of garlic-stuffed boar's snout. Yes, you heard that right. Boar's snout. Garlic stuffed. Who could resist? Or, more accurately, who could survive? The hall is bathed in flickering candlelight, which does little to mask the overpowering garlic fumes cascading from the kitchen. The air is thick, a mixture of burnt cress, old ale, and the kind of musk only a medieval feast can manufacture. Enter Sir Reginald, a knight famed less for battlefield glory and more for his notoriously delicate nose. His arrival sends discreet but desperate sniffles echoing throughout the hall. Our other key player is Lady Mildred, the self-appointed humanitarian of the village, whose scent is as fresh as spring daisies, mostly because she's been brewing endless lavender and rose water spritzes to combat the garlic siege. The boar's snout is more than a dish tonight, it's a social minefield. Now, here's where the absurdity escalates. The garlic is believed to possess protective qualities, warding off not just vampires, a concept just gaining popularity, but, oddly, also last year's outbreak of bad breath plague. Villagers partake in an ungainly ritual. Each bite of the stinky snout must be immediately followed by a teaspoon of honey and a whispered apology to one's digestive spirits. Failure to comply risks a social death worse than a medieval quarantine. Tensions spike as Sir Reginald, sneezing uncontrollably, accidentally sprays Lady Mildred with a mist of garlic-infused breath. She gasps in horror, clutching her delicate handkerchief, a gesture interpreted as a cruel slight given the era's etiquette rules. The hall erupts in whispers and scandalous speculation. Has the knight insulted the saintly lady? Is this the beginning of a feud that will divide the village for decades? The climax arrives when the village priest calls for calm, declaring that charity, and perhaps some forgiveness, are essential virtues. In an unexpected act of kindness, Lady Mildred offers Sir Reginald her prized lavender water to cleanse the offensive scent. In doing so, kindness triumphs over pungency, and the great garlic feud dissolves like steam from the cooking pot. Historically, garlic has long been both revered and reviled, serving as medicinal marvel, culinary staple, and apocalypse ward. Its powerful scent has inspired countless myths, from protective amulet to social weapon, much like the boar's snout tonight. So remember, the moral of our tale? When life hands you a garlic-stuffed boar's snout, don't just hold your nose. Offer a spritz of kindness instead. Picture this. Year 1347. Somewhere in a damp, not-so-stylish European village where the smell of unwashed wool mingles delightfully with the aroma of something just slightly less edible. The sun casts a lazy orange glow on a square filled with nervous townsfolk clutching their baskets of suspiciously hard bread. Yes, this is the scene of the great medieval bread debate, an event numerous historians describe as the yeast-fueled chaos that threatened to crumble the very structure of society. The stage, a marketplace as lively as a plague doctor's schedule. The players, blind bakers, overly suspicious nobles, and your average serf with a taste bud rebellion. Our protagonist, the humble loaf of brown bread, crustier than a tax collector's promises and more contentious than the latest royal decree. The air is thick with anxiety, a curious blend of burnt crust and impending doom. Bards on the corner sing tunes about grain shortages, while local pigeons decide this is an excellent time to practice aerial attacks on anyone brave enough to eat. Now, bread in this era was the MVP of the diet, unless you were a noble who sniffed in disdain at anything without a shadow of butter or gold leaf. But the real suspense lies not in the consumption, but in the suspicion. You see, medieval bread was rumored to be a political pamphlet disguised as food. One bite could supposedly reveal the baker's allegiance amid the ever-shifting alliances of local lords. Rituals ensued. Before a loaf was shared, it had to be inspected by the village's self-appointed bread oracle, a woman whose title was less about expertise and more about her impressive ability to spit accusations. She would chant over the dough, invoking the spirits of wheat and warning against bread that was too perfectly round or too suspiciously dense. Meanwhile, whispers circulated that certain loaves were intentionally baked with just a pinch of rye. a noble poison meant to send messages encoded in gluten. Paranoia peaked when a batch of rye-studded loaves turned up mysteriously at the mayor's feast, causing a frenzy of interrogations, accusations, and impromptu bread trials. Were these rye loaves a symbol of rebellion, or just an unfortunate baking experiment? The ensuing chaos resulted in a peculiar form of medieval vigilante justice, involving rolling pins and heel kicks that historians have politely dubbed the loafin' offense. But the twist? The so-called poison was nothing more than a rare strain of rye that, when baked, caused mild indigestion. The mayor, too proud to admit he'd fallen victim to a gluten glitch, blamed an elaborate conspiracy involving foreign spies, rival bakers, and the mischievous local pigeons. Historically, bread has been more than sustenance. It has been a cornerstone of social identity and political discourse. In medieval times, your choice of loaf could make or break alliances, and sometimes lead to accidental food fights. So, what lesson can we glean from this flowery farce? Trust your bread, but maybe not the ones that come with secret rye agendas. After all, nothing unites a village quite like fear of carb-based espionage. Cue the pungent fanfare. The year, a seemingly innocent date somewhere in the oppressive yet aromatic backdrop of Renaissance Italy. The setting, a bustling open-air market in Florence, where merchants hawk everything from hand-stitched velvet hose to suspiciously mushy parmesan. But the star of tonight's fiasco isn't art or politics. It's garlic. Yes, garlic. The bulbous, misunderstood cousin of the kitchen that smells like a skunk at a symphony. As the sun dips toward the Tuscan hills, the air thickens with not only the smoke of roasted chestnuts, but also the unmistakable stench of garlic. Fresh, crushed, and slapped onto every conceivable dish. Our key players? Marco, the nervous spice merchant who claims his bulbs are imported straight from the underworld's gardens, or at least the next village, and Isabella, the aspiring noblewoman who believes garlic wards off not just vampires, but inconvenient suitors. The marketplace bustles under flickering torches and the occasional sneeze epidemic. The lights bounce off glimmering copper pots, and the wisps of smoke curling lazily like artists pondering their next masterpiece. The air is a cocktail of roasting meats, damp cobblestones, and garlic. Lots of garlic. The crowds sway, a mix of eager buyers and paranoid townsfolk, convinced that even a passing whiff of this potent herb could alter their love fortunes or digestive fate. Tensions simmer like an overzealous marinara sauce. Garlic, in this era, is both a blessing and a curse, a culinary charm and a social weapon. Superstitions abound. Rub garlic on your doorframe to repel bad luck, or sneak a clove into your betrothed purse to ensure fidelity. Wariness among the noble class transforms garlic into the... Picture this. Europe, mid-16th century, inside an overly ornate tavern that smells of stale ale, burnt wood, and the faint but persistent aroma of a mystery stew suspiciously resembling week-old shoes. Lamps flicker unsteadily, casting elongated shadows that look like cartographers having a heated argument about whether the world really was flat. The air buzzes with the clatter of mugs, grumbles of sea captains, and the occasional sneeze from an allergic nobleman, who, through heroic denial, insists he is not allergic to anything, including bad decisions. Here, gathered under the watchful eye of a slightly confused but enthusiastic chef, the evening centerpiece is the much-discussed New World stew, an ambitious culinary experiment involving ingredients supposedly from undiscovered lands, which might or might not include a suspiciously imported potato and definitely questionable spices. The kitchen itself is a hub of chaos, where half the cooks are busy consulting an ancient map marked with red X's and the other half are arguing whether seasoning the stew with a pinch of cynicism counts as authentic seasoning at all. Enter our key characters. Gustav, the overly curious cartographer, whose love for new territories exceeds his taste tolerance. Lady Mildred, whose interest in food only extends as far as it can be used to inflict social humiliation. And the chef, a man with the unwavering belief that mixing mystery meat with suspicion is a recipe for success. The stew isn't just a dish. It's an act of geopolitical bravery and gastronomic roulette wrapped into one simmering pot. As the stew bubbles, anticipation builds, like a suspicious fog rolling in off the ocean, thick with the possibility of flavor disaster or unremarkable blandness. Tonight's dinner is accompanied by ancient rituals such as the skeptical sniff test, the obligatory declaration of which ingredients are definitely not poisonous, plus a small parade of dubious lore about how the stew can supposedly grant navigational wisdom or the gift of diplomatic immunity. Ignoring these, our brave diners proceed to ladle, each bite a gamble closer to either culinary enlightenment or digestive rebellion. Tensions rise when Gustav declares the stew tastes like 3 shipwrecks and a dash of betrayal, stirring whispers that perhaps the chef stole ingredients from a rival's pantry, or that the stew itself is a coded map to a lost treasure, probably lying under a forgotten potato sack. The climax arrives as Lady Mildred, attempting to feign delight, discreetly passes her bowl to an unsuspecting dog, triggering an uproarious mix of apologies, accusations, and a near duel involving a wooden spoon. But here comes the twist. The New World stew turns out to be an accidental recipe for an excellent hangover cure. Though nobody admits it, the stew's blend of mystery, spice, and outright confusion leaves all diners with unexpected stamina for the next day's disputes and scandals. Historically, it should be noted that such spices and new ingredients really did flood into Europe thanks to explorers. But rather than immediately improve cuisine, they often wound noble palates and ignited suspicion about their origins. Much like a weird cousin showing up unannounced at a family dinner. So, what do we learn from this stewing historical mess? If you are ever tempted to spice up your life with uncharted ingredients, remember, in matters of stew and diplomacy, it's always safer to stick to what your great-grandmother's cookbook, accurate or not, prescribes. After all, no map is worth. Picture this, the year's 1023. A foggy morning cloaks a small village in medieval England so thick you could lose a night in it twice over. The smell? A pungent blend of damp wool and over-enthusiastic livestock. But today, the village buzz isn't about the weather, no, the drama centers on bread. Yes, bread, that innocent staple. Now, the epicenter of a yeasty soap opera, the village bakehouse huddled between the alehouse and the blacksmith rings with tension. Its low ceiling swathed in smoke from last night's. Fire, the scent of burning oak mingling with flour dust and a suspiciously sour tang that puts everyone on edge. Meet Gertrude the baker. A woman whose hands have kneaded more dough than a congregation has said prayers, yet today, her eyes flicker with something beyond weary thirst. Hubert, the village miller whose flour is the stuff of legend, mostly because half his grain ended up mysteriously missing last month. But the star of the show is the loaf itself, a hefty round, claiming to be the finest in all the shires, though skeptics whisper it's more brick than bread. Now here lies the absurdity. Ancient bread worship rituals kick in. The villagers circle the loaf, chanting blessings to invoke protection against the dreaded black dough curse, a feared affliction that promises inedible rock-hard bread for 7 generations. A superstition likely invented during last harvests. Great rye famine, when everyone ate sawdust and misery. Yet despite the chants, the tension rises as the local lord approaches with the ceremonial butter knife poised like Excalibur itself. A hush falls like a woolen blanket pierced by a knight's sarcastic cough. It is the moment of truth. Will the bread break clean? Will it crumble? Will it spark a diplomatic incident? Suddenly, with a sound like a crack in the earth, the loaf fractures not a clean slice, but a jagged chasm, unleashing crumbs like confetti at a royal wedding. Gasps ripple through the crowd. Some clutch their stomachs, others clutch their pearls, some even clutch their disappointment. The moment twists as old Agnes, the village gossip, steps forward, claiming the loaf tastes suspiciously like rye. Something scandalous, given the local miller swore a sacred oath to never mix grains lest the bread betray the purity of the past. This revelation sends ripples of outrage ripping through the villagers like a poorly cast fishing net. In that fraught moment, the Lord bursts into laughter, revealing he baked the loaf himself as a prank to settle once and for all whether superstition or skill ruled the day. His confession is met with a mixture of relief, horror, and roars of laughter that could shake the rafters of the bakehouse. Historically speaking, bread was indeed a big deal in medieval Europe, not just for nutrition, but as a symbol of social status and trust. Often, the finest bread was reserved for the elite, while commoners nibbled on the boot leather variety. So, what do we glean from this flour-filled fiasco? Bread is not just food, it is politics, religion, and the original social media all rolled into one doughy conspiracy. And the takeaway? Knead your bread and picture, if you will, a dusty donkey path somewhere along the ancient Judean wilderness, roughly year 30 AD. The time, just after breakfast, when the smell of overcooked barley mingles oddly with the whiff of suspicious sandals. Here lies our humble hero, a man recently bested by highwaymen and considerably worse luck. On the menu today, stale bread, olives, and a side of imminent doom. The sun beats down like an overzealous temple tax collector, while forlorn birds caw tunes suspiciously close to gangster rap. Enter our key players. First, the beaten traveler, whose wardrobe screams, "I've seen better days," and whose expression rehearses despair. Then, the priest and the Levite, the religious bigwigs of the era, too busy checking their sandal straps and visions to lend a hand. Finally, our unexpected Samaritan, a man whose people are usually the villains of the story, but today, shocker, plays rescuer. The food at center stage, that humble loaf of bread, a symbol of sustenance turned into a prop of controversy. But the real tension isn't just this man's beaten body, it's the bread, which carries a smell wafting between edible and bone-crushingly stale. Now onto the rituals, because in this time and place, even kindness came with caveats. Priests believed touching an injured man deprived them temporarily of ritual purity, a catastrophic inconvenience considering their next temple selfie. The Levite, equally paranoid, feared contagion, despite the minor wounds resembling more a violent handshake gone wrong. Meanwhile, the Samaritan, a member of a people often mistrusted by the locals, might as well have been wearing a neon sign saying social pariah. Yet, in this bizarre religious and social cocktail, he chooses to act. He bandages, he lifts, and then, in an act that surely rattled every neighborhood grapevine, he rides off with the poor soul on his donkey to an inn. What of the innkeeper? A gentlemanly opportunist who immediately niches the guest as prime for overcharging, promising better than the road nutrition in gloomy candlelit quarters. Talk about a startup with dubious ethics. The grand twist? That bread, the same loaf causing silent judgment and social hesitation, ultimately proves innocuous, if a little inviting to local mice, and no one dies from its consumption. Our beaten man survives, all thanks to a Samaritan whose actions break every mental firewall of hatred and suspicion. In historical context, this story resonates beyond its religious origins. It upends tribal bigotry and champions basic human decency, even when the loaf looks like it could double as a brick. So, what have we learned from this ancient roadside drama? Never underestimate a stale loaf's power to test humanity, and if you see a Samaritan, maybe consider he's just the world's premier gatecrasher for kindness. Moral? When life hands you a moldy loaf, offer it boldly, and maybe a bandage too. Because sometimes doing good is less about divine rituals and more about not being a social disaster. Picture this: Europe, 16th century. A bustling village square filled with the aroma of freshly baked bread and the unmistakable zest of gingerbread. A treat so beloved it could spark the quietest peasant to sing or start a riot. On a brisk autumn morning, with the sun casting long shadows over timber-framed houses, the annual gingerbread festival was unfolding. But something was in the air. Something stickier than molasses and twice as controversial. The scene is alive with color and chaos. Orange and black garlands flutter in the chilly breeze. Children dart through crowds wielding gingerbread men like edible swords, and vendors shout over each other to hawk their spiced wares. The scent is intoxicating: cinnamon, clove, and a hint of rebellion. Enter our key players. The Gingerbread Guild, a powerhouse of bakers sworn to uphold the sanctity of the recipe rumor. Had it, the spice mix was guarded like royal secrets. Or the crown jewels, but with less sparkle and more sugar. And the newly minted Mayor Heinrich, a man whose teeth gleamed almost as brightly as his ambitions to modernize the village, one confection at a time. The gingerbread itself is no ordinary cookie. Its golden brown surface is etched with elaborate designs, swirling patterns symbolizing prosperity, and faces that suspiciously resemble local aristocrats. Yet, underneath its sweet veneer, tension simmered like a pot of boiling honey. Superstition dictated that sharing gingerbread was not just a gesture of goodwill, but a sacred act that ensured peace and good fortune. To change the recipe, or, heaven forbid, add a new ingredient, was tantamount to inviting curses, famine, or worse, economic downturns. The mayor, however, with dreams of improving sales, dared to introduce a secret ingredient, a dash of imported white sugar, an exotic luxury that scandalized the guild. The Gingerbread Guild reacted swiftly, accusing him of heresy and culinary blasphemy. Rumors flew that the new sugar would cause the cookies to lose their magical properties, perhaps even turn the village's fortunes sour. Chaos ensued. Market stalls were boycotted. The mayor's gingerbread was discarded in public squares, trampled underfoot in a spectacle of edible defiance. Secret meetings were held behind bakery doors, under the cover of flour and flashing rolling pins, plotting how to preserve tradition. Meanwhile, the villagers, caught between craving the novelty and fearing doom, found themselves in a carb-induced turmoil. And just when the situation seemed as baked as the gingerbread itself, a peculiar twist changed everything. A group of mischievous children, bored with grown-up squabbles, swapped the mayor's sugar-laden cookies for the guild's traditional batch during the festival's climax. The result? An impromptu taste test that dissolved decades of tension in a single bite. The villagers, united by delayed gratification and delighted taste buds, realized both recipes had merit. The so-called Great Gingerbread Rebellion fizzled out as quickly as it had flared, leaving behind a blended recipe and a curious lesson about the power of sweet compromise. Historical note: while no actual rebellion over gingerbread is recorded in the annals of history, the story allegorically reflects many real food disputes of the era, from salt taxes to spice wars, where culinary choices had consequences beyond the palate. And the moral of the story: if you ever find yourself caught in a doughy dispute, remember, sometimes it takes a crumb of courage and a sprinkle of compromise fade in to a bustling medieval village square, year 1387. The sun glares down like a dishwasher on triple rinse, and the aroma drifting through the cobblestone streets is unmistakably freshly baked bread. But not just any bread. The legendary rye of Rancor, a loaf so revered and so viciously fought over that it might as well have been forged in the fires of Utrecht's eternal debate over who gets the last slice. The scene is a kaleidoscope of colors and chaos. Vendor carts stacked with loaves crusty enough to scuff armor, the gentle murmur of gossip about last week's bake-off scandal, and a faint undertone of hyperventilating peasants hoping their ration doesn't mysteriously shrink. If you listen closely between the clinking of coins and the munching of what is clearly not stale bread, you can hear the soft hiss of simmering rivalry. Enter our key players. Madeline, the village baker, whose yeast mastery borders on alchemy. Old Gregor, the oft-complaining but mysteriously well-fed village elder. And Sir Thistledown, a nobleman whose carriage sparkles with more polish than his manners. Each eyes the debate over the rye of Rancor with the intensity of a cat stalking an open tuna can. Bread, dear viewers, was not simply sustenance. It was a currency, a status symbol, and occasionally a weapon. The rye of Rancor, infused with secrets only known by Madeline and a suspiciously twitchy rat, was said to imbue strength, wit, and occasionally indigestion. The villagers worshipped it as if it were a blessing from the bread gods themselves, a belief supported by a curious ritual where every loaf was tapped thrice before slicing, ostensibly to awaken the spirits trapped inside. Spoiler alert, no spirits were ever awakened, but it did startle the cat. Tension rises as the village prepares for the annual breaking of the rye, a ceremony part Game of Thrones, part food fight, and all spectacle. Superstitions add layers of absurdity. Some insist the first slice must be offered to the poorest as a goodwill gesture. Others fear it curses one's luck if consumed before the church bell tolls thrice. Between whispered rumors of sabotage by rival bakers and a petty feud over yeast quality, the atmosphere is so thick you could slice it with a butter knife. And yet, as the moment approaches, the grand twist unfolds. The nobleman, Sir Thistledown, expected to lord over the ceremony with his customary disdain, instead trips spectacularly over a stray cartwheel, launching his ceremonial loaf unceremoniously into the mud. The crowd gasps, then erupts in laughter that drowns out even the urgent prayers that the rye of rancor never really did grant lasting powers. Historical tidbit. Medieval bread was often so dense and unleavened it required violent machinations to even be considered edible, the exact opposite of today's artisanal, air-puffed masterpieces. And so, the rye of rancor, with its crust a little tougher than expected, reminds us that sometimes history's greatest battles are not fought with swords, but with crumbs. So remember, in a world where bread can start wars, it's often best to just share your loaf and avoid the crumb trail of chaos. Picture this. Rome, 64 AD. The city basking under a golden sunset. The Forum alive with bustling senators and toga-clad food critics complaining about the lack of good olives. The steamy aroma of roasted dormice mingles awkwardly with the faint but persistent scent of political backstabbing. And just beyond, a lavish banquet tent swarms with the empire's elite, nervously circling a single culinary star, the infamous fermented fish sauce known as garum. If you've never tried garum, congratulations. It smells like a fish market after 3 days of regrets, but tastes like what happens when a philosopher accidentally takes a bite of the ocean's wrath. The tent is lit by hundreds of flickering oil lamps, casting a suspiciously flattering glow that does little to dispel lingering doubts about the odd little amphora of garum sitting at the seat of honor. Senators exchange glances that say, "You try first, I insist," while servants scurry around balancing trays stacked with pine nuts and stuffed dormice, the overnight snack special. The air buzzes with whispered superstitions. Garum is said to bestow wisdom, or perhaps madness, depending on the alignment of the stars and the cook's sour mood. Some guests cautiously dab their tongues with wine, hoping to wash away the impending gastronomic gamble. Amidst the chatter, a peculiar ritual unfolds. A priestess of Fortuna Patron, goddess of fortune, and, conveniently, questionable dinner outcomes solemnly blesses each amphora, muttering incantations that sound suspiciously like a hangover cure or an ancient Yelp review. Meanwhile, a nervous tribune insists on inspecting each batch with the reverence usually reserved for captured enemy standards, eyeing the murky liquid like it might explode or summon Poseidon's ghost. Tension simmers as the evening progresses. The garum gambit, as it will later be known, reaches fever pitch when the illustrious Senator Publius Claudius nervously tips his tripod cup filled with the pungent sauce toward his lips. His face contorts. Was that a wince of pain? Or perhaps the dawning realization that his political enemies may have spiked the batch with a particularly potent garum from the less reputable docks. A dropped spoon here, a whispered curse there. And suddenly, the banquet devolves into a frenzy where accusations fly faster than the roasted dormice being snatched from platters. But just when chaos threatens to upend the feast, a lowly plebeian named Marcus, who had slipped in hoping for scraps, boldly steps forward. Without ceremony, he grabs the amphora, takes a hearty swig of the garum, and declares, "It tastes like fish as fish should." This act of unpretentious bravery diffuses the tension as everyone else grudgingly follows suit. The feast is saved, if not exactly enjoyed. The garum remains suspiciously potent, but nobody dies, which in Rome's culinary history counts as a win. Historically speaking, garum was indeed the ketchup of the ancient Romans, ubiquitous, beloved, and frequently blamed for the occasional batch that set stomachs awry. The great Roman feast fiasco reminds us that sometimes it only takes one brave soul to drink the ocean's regrets and teach a room full of nobles the humble art of acceptance. So the takeaway? When life hands you a gallon of questionable fish sauce, don't make a spectacle. Just swallow it with courage and maybe keep a goblet of wine close by. Set your time machines to a foggy, cobblestone London street. Circa 1776. The air is thick with the scent of horse dung, coal smoke, and something oddly pungent that nobody can quite place. Spoiler alert, its origins will soon be blasted into a mustardy catastrophe. Picture a humble tavern called the Wilted Turnip, where gentlemen in tricorner hats congregate to argue politics, colonial taxes, and, most importantly, the perfect pickle accompaniment. Our central characters. Mr. Bartholomew Plumridge, self-proclaimed pickle connoisseur and part-time mischief maker. Mrs. Agatha Bramble, the tavern's formidable landlady with a razor-sharp tongue and a recipe book that doubles as a weapon. And the notorious mustard pot, a ceramic relic so ancient it might have witnessed the signing of the Magna Carta, or at least a tavern brawl. The lighting is a theatrical blend of smoky lantern flickers and shadows that could suggest anything from secret plots to just leftover grease on the walls. The floorboards creak under the weight of hushed whispers and the clinking of pint glasses. The smells are a confusing cocktail of stale ale, damp wool, and the latent anxiety of impending condiment disaster. Enter the mustard, seemingly innocuous, but actually the tinderbox of social upheaval, because in 1776 London mustard was not just a spread, it was a cultural identity. Its preparation was a ritual bordering on ceremonial. First, the mustard seed had to be crushed with a granite pestle, blessed by a local reverend or an exceptionally religious pigeon. Then it was mixed with a precise concoction of vinegar, honey, and a secret blend of spices whispered only during the full moon. This golden elixir was rumored to cure everything from plague to poor table manners. Now, here's where things take a slippery turn. Mr. Plumridge, in his infinite wisdom, or grievous lack thereof, decided to replace the revered mustard ingredients with a fiery batch of his own invention, which involved a suspicious amount of horseradish and a pinch of what may have been chili powder smuggled from the exotic reaches of Portsmouth. Mrs. Bramble, discovering the switch moments before the grand pickle tasting competition, went into a frenzy so intense you'd think someone just declared war on the Crown's favorite condiment. Tensions escalated like fireworks on Guy Fawkes night. Patrons seized their ceramic mustard pots like shields. The tavern's ancient cat hissed in protest, and Mr. Plumridge attempted a hasty escape, only to be tackled by a particularly stout brewer wielding a barrel tap. The spectacle culminated in what historians now refer to as the Great Mustard Meltdown. A chaotic splatter of yellow stains, flying pickles, and verbal jousting delivered with the precision of Shakespearean epics, albeit far less eloquent. But here's the twist that would make even the sternest Georgian chuckle. The rebellious mustard concoction, despite its initial revulsion, was later declared the most invigorating condiment in the entire West End. Food critics, whose palates were as delicate as handkerchiefs, were forced to admit a grudging admiration for its piquant audacity. Mr. Plumridge, once the pariah of the wilted turnip, was knighted by the local mustard guild, a dubious honor that ensured his status as a condiment celebrity for years to come. Historically speaking, the incident illustrates the sometimes tumultuous relationship between culinary tradition and innovation, especially when horseradish gets involved. It's a reminder that food is never just food. It's politics, religion, and the occasional episode of public chaos smeared onto a sandwich. So what's the takeaway? Always handle mustard with care. One wrong move, and you might not just ruin a pickle, you might start a condiment revolution. And remember, kindness is spreading joy, not horseradish in your neighbor's mustard pot. Picture this. The year is 52 BC. Somewhere in Gaul, just outside a rival chieftain's poorly constructed roundhouse, where the air carries not just the earthy scent of mud and moss, but an omnipresent whiff of something a bit, shall we say, more pungent than your average village dinner. The sun hangs low, casting a dramatic orange glow that makes even the bravest Gaulish warriors squint and regret their breakfast choices. Tonight, we witness the curious case of garlic. Not just any garlic, but the kind of garlic so potent it could double as a weapon of mass odor destruction. Enter our key players. Vercingetorix, the local warlord with a sword as sharp as his wit, and thankfully less stale breath, and a horde of decidedly nervous villagers, clutching handfuls of what appears to be every clove of garlic they could pilfer. The setting? A feast meant to unify clans, but risks igniting a nasal revolution instead. The Great Garlic Gala promised to be a culinary event for the ages, complete with roaring fires, dubious fermented meats, and, of course, mountains of garlic mashed into every conceivable dish. The lighting flickers from firelight to the occasional cautious torch glow, a subtle reminder that in these parts, darkness isn't just an absence of light, but a cover for potentially catastrophic digestive aftermaths. The smells bounce between delicious herbiness and the unmistakable hint of what some would call a biohazard incident in the making. As platters are passed, a ritual unfolds. Sniff, grimace, brave a bite, and then cautiously plan one's exit strategy from lingering stench zones. Garlic, you see, was no mere seasoning. It was a symbol, fearsome and unyielding. Legend had it that consuming too much garlic would not only repel invading Romans, but also ward off unwanted suitors and, curiously enough, rebellious livestock. This night was tinged with a peculiar paranoia, how to enjoy the feast without being ostracized for one's breath. Then came the tension, palpable and heavy, like the garlic hanging thick in the air. Neighbors eyed each other suspiciously, weighing the social cost of nibbling garlic-laden bread versus the diplomatic disaster of eating a bland meal and inviting ridicule. Superstitions ran rampant. Some whispered that garlic could ward off evil spirits. Others swore it attracted them if prepared incorrectly. There was even a brief, unsettling debate about whether garlic added post-feast flatulence was a sign of divine favor or impending doom. Just as a brave soul attempted to make an impromptu toast with a garlicky wine, which was met with a chorus of gasps so sharp they could have sliced cheese, a sudden twist emerged. The village dog, long considered a silent observer, vaulted onto the table and, with alarming enthusiasm, devoured an entire bowl of garlic stew. The crowd held its breath. Would the dog perish? Would the Romans use this as an excuse to invade? To everyone's surprise, the mutt only sneezed a few times, then trotted off wagging its tail, apparently none the worse for wear. This unexpected canine endorsement of garlic not only eased tensions, but turned the garlic gala into a legend of bravery and resilience. Historically, garlic has earned its place as both a beloved flavor and a suspicious neighbor in the culinary neighborhoods of history. From ancient Egyptians worshipping its powers to medieval peasants swearing by its health benefits, the lowly clove has always been a bit of a wild card. The lesson here? When life gives you garlic, and an entire village fearful of social exile, sometimes all it takes is a dog willing to gobble up your fears and remind us that kindness and a little bravery can neutralize even the stinkiest situations. Picture this. The year is 4 BCE, and the town square of a little Gallic village is bustling with the kind of excitement usually reserved for annual tax collection or impending invasions. It's a warm afternoon, the sun casting a suspiciously cheerful glow on the predominantly mud and stone skyline. The scent in the air is a curious blend of fresh bread, unwashed bodies, and livestock with ambitions of escape. Enter Julius Caesar, or at least a man trying to look like him, perched atop a horse that has clearly never been to a spa day. The occasion? A grand feast purported to celebrate the peace between Rome and Gaul. Though rumor has it the only thing peaceful that day was the wine after a few rounds. Our food of honor, wild boar stew, lovingly and liberally seasoned to mask what historians now believe was the cook's general confusion about spices. The village square is a cacophony of clinking goblets, haughty chatter, and the occasional bray of a mule who knows more about diplomacy than the assembled dignitaries. Lighting. The kind of flickering torchlight that turns every shadow into a potential assassination plot. The feast comes with rituals that would make a soap opera look like daytime TV. Before eating, participants had to recite a lengthy prayer asking their gods to protect them from both indigestion and betrayal, a subtle hint that dining was as much about survival as it was about taste buds. Superstition ran thicker than the stew itself. Anyone who dared to spit on the ground risked being labeled a witch or a spy. And, naturally, the stew was rumored to be mysteriously seasoned by a rival faction aiming to turn Roman generals into less competent generals. As the stew was ladled into bowls, tension rose faster than the bubbles in the questionable wine. Eyes darted suspiciously. Whispers floated on the night breeze like so many mistrustful ghosts. Suddenly, the chief taster, a man with a notable chin and an even more notable fear of dying, took a spoonful and promptly turned the shade of freshly curdled goat cheese. The crowd held its breath so long that one unfortunate bard's lute string snapped from the silence. Around him, the drama unfolded. Accusations flared. The cook was accused of carrying poison-laced herbs, and a particularly over-enthusiastic guard actually tried to arrest the stew itself. But here is the twist. After a very thorough examination involving several rounds of wine and an impromptu investigation that would make Sherlock Holmes weep with envy, it turned out the toxic stew was merely the result of the cook using a double dose of garlic. The horror. The subtle assassination attempt replaced by excessively pungent breath. Ah, history. Forever reminding us that sometimes our greatest crises are just culinary missteps. To put this into perspective, Caesar did survive this feast and went on to conquer quite a bit more territory, possibly fueled by sheer determination or just the adrenaline from expecting every meal to be his last. So, what have we learned from this episode of Gastronomic Mayhem? When hosting peace treaties, always double-check your spice rack and maybe invest in better breath mints. Remember, in history, imagine, if you will, the bustling agora of ancient Athens circa 432 BCE. Sunlight bouncing off marble columns, the smell of olive oil wafting through the air, mingled disturbingly with the less agreeable stench of poorly fermented fish sauce, a delicacy many pretended to enjoy. On this fine morning, the centerpiece of the communal table is no grand beast or exotic fruit, but a simple, humble loaf of bread, crust tough enough to imperil a gladiator's jaw and crumb dense as an orator's pointless speech. Enter Demetrius, a renowned baker and part-time philosopher, who swears that his sourdough can transcend the very soul of mankind, or, failing that, at least keep away the famine. The atmosphere is electric, punctuated by the rhythmic clanking of amphorae being lifted and the distant squawks of squab, signaling the start of another day in the Athenian democracy, where even stale bread can ignite passions fiercer than the Peloponnesian War. Yet, our tale is not merely about nourishment, but about the absurd, exalted rituals Greeks devised to honor their grain gods before breaking bread, including a solemn chant that suspiciously resembles the chants used to exorcise disgruntled neighbors from the market. These rituals, performed with grave seriousness and exaggerated flourish, were designed to ensure the loaf would not curse its eater with indigestion or, even worse, social disgrace. The crowd watches with bated breath as Demetrius slices a piece and offers it to the neighborhood philosopher-clown, known simply as Socrates, who responds by scrutinizing it as if it harbored the secrets to universal truth. Or, more likely, a sign of impending plague. Tension mounts as strange superstitions surface. Some claim that the yeast used was a relic from the sacred mountaintop yeast. Others whisper it was mixed with a forbidden herb. The paranoia peaks when a rival baker accuses Demetrius of sorcery and clandestine use of a recipe purchased from a Spartan defector. Here in Athens, a loaf was not just a loaf. It was a declaration of power, a threat veiled thinly in carbs, the ultimate weapon in the daily bread game. Then comes the twist that shocks the crowd. Upon tasting the bread, Socrates bursts out laughing, not at the bread's taste, but because he just realized the loaf was cleverly shaped like a foot, mocking the sacred rituals themselves. The tension, once tight enough to crumble walls, evaporates into contagious merriment. Behind the laughter, the real lesson simmers. Even in the grand theater of ancient politics and bread, Sometimes kindness is as simple as sharing a joke over a crusty loaf. Historically speaking, bakers like Demetrius didn't just nourish bellies. They fed civic spirit by turning food into social commentary, a practice that eventually inspired more lawsuits over recipes than over land disputes. So, next time you break bread, remember, it might just be the yeast that binds, or the foot-shaped prank that frees. Lesson learned? Never underestimate the power of carbs to unite or court disaster. All it takes is the right slice of humor. Picture it. 873 AD, a moonlit fjord somewhere in the less than sunny reaches of Scandinavia, where the local smell is an intoxicating blend of fish guts, fresh pine, and the faint, ominous hint of impending feasts that often double as bloodbaths. The Vikings have gathered around a fire pit the size of a small conspiracy, eager to put hospitality and home-cooked meals to the test, or rather, to confound them spectacularly. The main culinary attraction? A bowl of fermented shark, also known as hakarl, a delicacy so pungent it could clear a hall faster than a sudden raid. Imagine the firelight trapping swirling smoke and the chorus of guttural chuckles, the growls of sailors missing toes, and the occasional yelp from an unfortunate who dared to sniff the stuff too closely. Our key players include Ragnar the Hospitable, a chieftain whose generosity might have been driven more by a wish to outdo his neighbor than genuine kindness, and Thorvald the Cautious, who's learned the hard way that Viking hospitality can be lethal. The scene is set. Bowls of the infamous hakarl rest on roughly hewn wooden tables, surrounded by men with beards that could house entire bird colonies, and a suspicious glint in their eyes that says this feast may be our last or our greatest tale. The air vibrates with a mix of excitement and subtle fear, like everyone's just waiting to see who will be the first to keel over, from either poison or the awful taste. Enter the rituals. Before anyone dares take a bite, they engage in an age-old superstition, the hakarl smell test. This involves pinching nostrils, a rapid series of forced inhales, and a dramatic, exaggerated gag that doubles as a warning to all naive guests. Those who survive the olfactory ordeal proceed to the solemn toast with horned mugs, vowing allegiance to the gods, the chieftain, and the invisible force that keeps their stomachs from turning inside out. Meanwhile, Thorvald the Cautious discreetly inspects the fermented shark with the suspicion of a man who's heard too many hospitality stories ending in tragedy. He pulls aside a wanderer and whispers tales of secret Viking hospitality tests, where guests who fail disappear mysteriously, sometimes contributing to the feast themselves. Just as tension escalates, and a burly berserker prepares to swallow a chunk with the bravado of a man biting into his last meal, a child tugs on Ragnar's beard, revealing the twist. The fermented shark is, in fact, a prank concocted by the younger generation to weed out the fussiest relatives and ensure only the toughest inherit the clan's legacy. Suddenly, the mood shifts from tense dread to uproarious laughter. Even the hardest scars soften, and a makeshift Viking karaoke session erupts around the fire. The fermented shark might be terrible, but the show of kindness disguised as bravery is what truly sustains the tribe. Historically, Vikings were indeed known for hospitality, but their version came with a side of brutal honesty, and the occasional fermented nightmare served as an acceptance test. So what's the takeaway? In a Viking feast, kindness means surviving the taste test, or simply being the prankster smart enough to turn famine into fun. Picture this: Rome, 50 BCE. The sun sets on the Forum, casting long shadows over marble columns and suspiciously well-dressed pigeons. The scent? A curious blend of fermenting olives, unwashed togas, and the unmistakable aroma of freshly baked bread, which, given the era, was a miracle considering the oven technology involved probably required a minor deity sacrifice. Enter our key players. A bakery owner named Gaius Crustius, a senator with an ego bigger than the Colosseum, and a mob that's hangry enough to start politics on fire. The stage is set for the great bread debacle. Here's the dish. Bread wasn't just food. It was political currency, social glue, and the ancient Roman equivalent of a viral meme. But this was no ordinary bread. Oh no, it was the famed panis perfectus, a loaf so dense, so dry, and so ambitiously crusty that biting into it was akin to sacrificing one's jaw to the grain gods. People revered it, feared it, and whispered conspiracies about its secret yeast. Now, Roman rituals surrounding bread preparation were equal parts theatrical stan and terror. Every loaf was blessed by a pontifex not to be confused with a pizza chef, while reciting invocations designed to ward off curse-bearing rats and glutenless sympathizers. The bakers wore laurel wreaths not for fashion, but because it was the closest thing to a food safety helmet. Meanwhile, the ambient noise of the marketplace was less the chatter of patrons and more a cacophony of grumbles, complaints, and the occasional threat to overthrow the Republic if another loaf failed to appear by dawn. Enter the tension. The loaf scheduled for the gladiator games was mysteriously missing. Fingers pointed faster than a charioteer's whip. Was this sabotage? A gluten rebellion? Had the baker switched ingredients with rebel goat cheese? The senator was livid. How could one possibly entertain the masses without the sacred panis perfectus to accompany the blood sport? Paranoia spiraled to absurd heights. Guards frisked loaves for hidden daggers. Informants were bribed with olive oil, naturally for intel on potential carb conspirators. At one point, a baker underwent a public trial, not for theft, but for allegedly cursing the wheat. But then, in a twist worthy of ancient drama, the missing loaf was found, not stolen or destroyed, but, as it turned out, accidentally consumed by the emperor's pet pig, a notoriously picky eater with a penchant for carbs. The pig had outwitted the entire republic. The senator, having lost his mind and his bread, was forced to deliver a speech promising free grain to the populace, which was met with a collective groan, some say because they understood the aristocratic undertones. Others because they'd just realized the games might feature less spectacle and more piggish aftermath. Historically speaking, bread has always carried more weight than expected, sometimes literally crushing jaws, sometimes sparking riots with a simple crumb. Romans may have built roads, aqueducts, and empires, but they also built an entire political theater around one humble loaf. Picture it. 14th century England, a bustling market street drenched in the pungent cocktail of livestock sweat, stale ale, and just a hint of impending doom. The year is approximately 1348, and the air hums with the sort of cautious optimism only a plague-ridden populace can master. Enter the protagonist, Bob, a baker of humble origin but lofty ambition, whose latest culinary invention threatens to upend social order: the sandwich. The setting is Bob's tiny stall, lit by a flickering candle that casts heroic shadows on his flour-dusted face. The smell, a tantalizing mix of freshly baked bread and suspiciously aromatic slices of preserved meat, hastily salvaged from last night's questionable feast. The sounds are a curious medley of bartering peasants, dicing knives, and the occasional throat clearing, a soundtrack to turn even the most optimistic into a real worrier. Behold the sandwich, a slab of bread wedged with meat and precariously balanced with a sprig of herb that may or may not be parsley herbs were still the original 5-second rule for food safety. This was no ordinary snack. It was a revolutionary middleman between formal dining and eating with one's bare hands, a culinary coup that surprised friend and foe alike. But with great innovation comes great paranoia. You see, medieval England was not the era of simple noshing. Food, especially something as brazen as a portable meat stack, was entangled in superstitions and rituals that made today's dietary fads look like child's play. The sandwich was rumored to be cursed by a nun who had once tripped over a knight carrying exactly this meal. Others whispered about a secret society called the Breadmongers, sworn to protect the sanctity of loaf-to-meat ratios and punish those who dared eat with reckless abandon. The market square became a stage for a tense drama involving the sandwich's fate. Merchants eyed Bob's stall with a mix of envy and suspicion. A local priest muttered prayers against gluttony while fiddling nervously with his rosary, convinced the sandwich was a devilish ploy to distract his flock from heavenly duties. Children gawked wide-eyed, fearing the bread might bite back, while Bob, clad in an apron too stained for anyone's comfort, defended his culinary toddler with the fervor of a knight defending the realm. Then the twist. At the zenith of this sandwich scandal, as rumors of accidental possession and meat-related madness peaked, a patron bit into Bob's creation and promptly declared it delicious and, astonishingly, not enchanted. This declaration sent shockwaves through the market. Where were the curses? The sinister bread plots? The Society of Breadmongers? Turns out, sometimes a sandwich is just a sandwich, and not a prophetic artifact or the cause of the Black Death. Bob's creation quietly paved the way for centuries of lunchtime innovation, a humble reminder that not all historical hysteria is justified. Historically speaking, the sandwich as we know it is often attributed to John Montague, 4th Earl of Sandwich, in the 18th century. But our dear Bob was certainly on to an unofficial prototype. So much for historical accuracy when a good story is on the line. The moral of the story: when in doubt, put meat between bread, fear the curse of the sniff test, and remember that the most revolutionary thing about food might just be its ability to make a few people wildly uncomfortable for no good reason. After all, never underestimate the power of a sandwich to disturb a town and then quietly feed it all the same. Imagine Europe, 1317, a time when the Black Death was just warming up for the main event and fashion meant layers upon intimidating layers of felt hats that probably doubled as small bird habitats. Our tale unfolds in a bustling market square somewhere between the Holy Roman Empire and the realm of whatever duke that's currently in power. It was a crisp morning with sunlight piercing the fog, the air heavy with the scents of fresh bread, horse manure, and a suspiciously sweet exotic aroma nobody could quite place. Into this sensory buffet walked a humble fruit, the banana. Not from next door, not from the next kingdom, but from somewhere suspiciously tropical and definitely not recommended for peasant consumption. The market stalls brimmed with produce, cabbages declining in dignity, apples imperfectly round, and plums that looked like they'd seen better centuries. But the banana? Oh, the banana was the star, wrapped in intrigue and confusion. A yellow curved thing that looked like a small yellow snake, threatening, slightly sinister, and oddly fascinating. Was it fruit? Was it a joke? Was it a tool of the devil? To medieval minds, paradise was straightforward. Fruits grew on familiar trees and vegetables came from questionable soil. Anything else was witchcraft, or worse, a conspiracy. Enter Sir Reginald, a knight who recently traded his sword for a fork in a curious quest to prove himself cultured rather than just terrifying. His shiny armor was now polished diplomacy, that is, until he clumsily picked up the banana as if it were a fresh grenade. The crowd watched, breath held, as he examined the peel with the skepticism of a tax collector eyeing a new form of tribute. Tension rose. Nearby vendors whispered about curses, or secret plots by Moors to soften European resolve through the consumption of strange yellow fruit. A medieval fruit-tasting ritual began, an event so elaborate you'd think it was a coronation. The banana was passed around with white gloves, then inspected under a lens that suspiciously resembled a magnifying glass stolen from an apothecary. Ritual sprinklings of holy water attempted to cleanse the supposedly infernal fruit. The local monk recited prayers that loosely translated to bless this abomination, and may it not cause indigestion or, worse, an uncontrollable urge to dance. Meanwhile, local peasants speculated wildly. Would eating the banana grant supernatural strength, or did it sap one's honor? Was the peel a talisman or a trap? And just as Sir Reginald heroically peeled the banana, the crowd gasped. Did he avert doom, or invite it? He took a tentative bite. A moment of silence. Then another bite, this time with a hint of delight. The market erupted, not with fear, but laughter and applause. The banana was declared safe, and even slightly delicious. Historically, the banana's true journey to Europe was slow and mysterious, weaving through trade routes that smelled of spices, sweat, and opportunism. But this early encounter left a lasting impression that exotic things should be feared, even when they taste like candy. The moral: never underestimate the power of curiosity, even when it involves suspiciously tropical fruit in an era suspicious of everything but wool. And also, if you ever see a medieval knight wielding a banana, you've probably stumbled upon a diplomatic incident disguised as a snack. So embrace your inner Good Samaritan, if only to share a banana and avoid a fruit-induced medieval panic. Imagine Judea, 30 AD, mid-afternoon. The sun is shining on a dusty road, the scent of dry earth mingling with the faint aroma of roasted lamb. But today's main event isn't a feast, it's a sandwich. But not just any sandwich, oh no. This one is a veritable hot mess of olive oil, stale bread, and suspiciously pungent cheese, about to become the centerpiece of the century's first ever roadside food controversy. Picture the scene. A well-dressed Pharisee struts along the path, pockets heavy with righteous indignation and dusty scrolls. Nearby, a Levite is busy counting his coins, too distracted to notice anything but his own reflection in a puddle. And between them, a man lying half dead, best described as the unfortunate victim of a violent mugging and a poorly timed nap. The air hums with a symphony of distant bleats, a braying donkey, and the low murmur of judgmental whispers. Lighting is natural and merciless, the unforgiving desert sun harshly illuminating every bead of sweat and inch of dirt. The background smells are a delicate combination of sweat, dust, and a rogue fig or two squashed underfoot. And then, enter the Samaritan. Not famous for his sandwich-making skills, but certainly skilled in the art of inconvenient kindness. Forget the holy man's latest sermon. This guy is about to redefine charity, one awkward sandwich at a time. But oh, the tension. The Pharisee's cape twitches. The Levite shifts his gaze uncomfortably. This simple act of kindness is more subversive than a week's worth of pious sermons combined. Why? Because the idea of a Samaritan, a social pariah, stopping to help is like a vegetarian biting into a T-bone steak, against all instinct and expectation. Local customs dictate that one should only help neighbors who share your faction, bloodline, or at least your preferred brand of sandals. Meanwhile, the Samaritan, unbothered by sectarian squabbles, unwraps a hunk of bread, slathers on some goat cheese, sprinkles dried herbs, and awkwardly offers it to the poor stranger he just bound up with his own tunic. Cue the absurd rituals. The gathering crowd debates whether sharing food with an outsider is sacrilegious or the ultimate test of faith. A small child picks up a piece of the bread, sniffs it dubiously, then declares it smells like broken promises and promptly drops it again. Then the twist. The man wakes up mid-bite, misunderstanding the Samaritan's intentions and accidentally biting the Samaritan's finger, turning the noble act into a slapstick moment of pain and confusion. Historical context? Well, the story of the Good Samaritan is less about gourmet sandwiches and more about the radical concept of kindness transcending social divides, something that apparently required sandwiches and finger-biting to illustrate. So what do we take away from this roadside drama? Always share your lunch, even if it risks losing a finger or your dignity. The true spirit of kindness is messy, awkward, and occasionally a bit salty. Cue the spotlight. The year, approximately 33 AD, somewhere on a dusty, sun-baked road between Jerusalem and Jericho. The setting, a suspiciously quiet stretch of highway notorious for its bandits, bad hospitality, and an inexplicable shortage of roadside cafeterias. The air, dry and heavy with the scent of overcooked figs and the ever-present buzz of gossiping locusts. Tonight's star ingredient? A humble fig cake, that sticky, sweet snack destined for historical immortality, or at least a biblical footnote. Picture it. Our not-so-average Samaritan, a figure doused in religious controversy and social disdain, taking center stage with a fig cake in one hand and a bandaged stranger in the other. The lighting is harsh, courtesy of the midday sun, casting long shadows that seem to whisper, is this guy really about to perform an act of kindness, or just scouting for his next meal? Around them, the roadside ambiance is less than hospitable. The air carries the faint grumble of a distant donkey caravan. A couple of furtive snakes slither away, presumably offended by the prospect of human generosity, and a faint aroma of unwashed sandals lingers like an olfactory dare. Now, on to the absurdity. Figs, in historical culinary circles, were both venerated and feared, considered a delicacy by some, a suspiciously sticky inconvenience by others, and often the centerpiece of neighborhood disputes over theft and fig poaching laws. But our Samaritan's fig cake was no ordinary snack. Legend has it, he baked it under the skeptical gaze of his neighbors, who mused whether a Samaritan could truly bake something worthy of charity, or if it was just cleverly camouflaged rock-hard bread. This fig cake wasn't just food. It was a geopolitical statement sliced into wedges. Eating it meant aligning with the other, risking social ostracism, or worse, digestive revolt due to unexpected fig seeds. The local superstitions decreed that figs could cause prophetic dreams or prophetic flatulence. Either way, they were unpredictable. Just as intention reaches its peak, a twist unfolds. The fig cake, initially feared as a tool of subversion, turns out to be astonishingly delicious, so much so that even the most cynical onlookers, including a particularly grumpy Levite who was about to pass by, can't help but steal a bite. The act of kindness, wrapped in sugary fig goodness, disarms suspicion, dissolves ancient prejudices, and redefines roadside dining etiquette. Historically speaking, the Good Samaritan's fig cake recipe probably never existed. Fig recipes were mostly passed down orally and secretively, like super spicy gossip. But its symbolic power persists, reminding us that sometimes breaking bread or fig cake with your enemies is the first step to peace. So, what did we learn from this sticky, sweet encounter? When life gives you figs, don't just bake them into cake. Use them to bake friendships, or at least confuse your enemies with unexpected generosity. After all, kindness, much like figs, might be a bit messy, but always worth the bite. Picture it. Vienna, 1505. Twilight descends over the bustling town square where open-air markets flirt with the pungent aroma of spiced meats. Amid the chatter of townsfolk haggling over ducks that may or may not be ducks, one culinary delight stands accused of causing more riots than taxes: the humble sausage. Tonight, we find ourselves at the infamous Holy Sausage Stand owned by Hans, a man renowned not just for his knack for casing meat, but for unwittingly igniting territorial feuds with each pork link sold. The air is thick, lit with flickering torches that cast dancing shadows over suspicious glances exchanged between rival butchers. There's a certain je ne sais quoi about the mingling scents of smoked paprika and impending violence. Hans, sporting a mustache that could wield more power than the Emperor's decree, watches nervously as a crowd gathers, not for his savory treats but for an escalating squabble over the rightful ownership of the secret spice blend. Before you can say bratwurst, the tension stretches tighter than a sausage skin on a hot griddle. Legend has it that townsfolk believed consuming sausages crafted without proper homage to the local guild would curse one's digestion and social standing, a superstition almost as strong as their belief in the divine right of meat monopolies. Hans has been accused of sorcery, witchcraft, and the more mundane but equally serious offense of being a lousy chef. Ritualistic tastings begin, where elders dip sausages in mystery sauces while reciting incantations that probably originated from a cook's desperate attempt to remember the recipe. Meanwhile, rumors swirl that a neighboring village sent spies disguised as traveling minstrels to steal the coveted seasoning recipe, because why wage war when a well-timed jalapeno can incite culinary espionage? The frenetic scene escalates to the point where the mayor himself intervenes, not with laws or decrees, but by ordering everyone to pause and share a sausage, toasted over the communal fire. Confessions of secret spice recipes are exchanged mid-bite, laughter bubbles up like boiling lard, and suspicion sizzles out faster than overcooked wieners. The twist? Hans reveals that the entire secret blend was nothing but a smattering of common herbs plucked from his grandmother's garden. The so-called mystical spice war is thus exposed as a delightful farce fueled by paranoia and a pinch of misplaced pride. Historically, sausages have been more than food. They served as social glue and occasionally a declaration of war, proving that even the simplest meal has a layered history of power dynamics and peculiar traditions. So, the take-home here: when life hands you sausages, share them generously. Unless you're Hans, in which case maybe keep the spice mix a secret and consider investing in a picture this. England, mid-18th century. A foggy afternoon in a bustling market square, where the smell of horse manure mingles with the hopeful fragrance of fresh-baked pies so revered that one might suspect they were the currency of the realm instead of actual coins. Enter the hero of our absurd tale, Thomas Butterworth, a rather unremarkable baker with an ambition as inflated as his famous meat pies. The marketplace buzzes with energy. Vendors shout their wares, and amidst this chaos, Butterworth prepares to unveil his pièce de résistance, the royal pie, a culinary marvel rumored to contain every ingredient imaginable except subtlety and restraint. The scene is awash in golden afternoon light filtering through strands of tattered laundry and fluttering market tents. The air hums with the clatter of hooves, the squawk of protesting chickens, and a subtle whiff of impending disaster, likely emanating from Butterworth himself as he nervously adjusts his flour-dusted apron. Butterworth's royal pie isn't just food, it's a battleground of flavor politics. Historical records, which may or may not have been penned by the town gossip, recount the town's obsession with pies as a symbol of prosperity and social standing. To eat this pie was to stake your claim in the local hierarchy, a bite that whispered power and prestige, or indigestion and public humiliation. The preparation is a spectacle of its own. Butterworth consults his dusty recipe book, requiring specific rituals involving the ceremonial cracking of exactly 3 eggs because superstition holds that the 3rd egg wards off bad luck, or at least prevents the pie from collapsing. The dough is padded with the solemnity usually reserved for royal weddings, all while market-goers gather to witness the birth of this edible empire. But the tension rises faster than the yeast in Butterworth's dough. Superstitions run rampant. Some whisper that adding too much spice invites the wrath of the pie gods. Others insist that pies without a proper lattice top are cursed with eternal sogginess. Additionally, local lore warns that gazing too long at a pie pre-consumption might summon a horde of indigestion demons. As the pie emerges golden and steaming from the oven, anticipation hits a fever pitch. Butterworth cuts the first slice, revealing a chaotic medley of ingredients that look suspiciously like a wild gamble with leftovers. the twist? At the very moment Butterworth serves the pie to the town mayor, the self-appointed pie judge, a sudden pigeon dive-bombs the table, sending the prized slice airborne and into a conveniently placed mud puddle. The crowd gasps and then bursts into uncontrollable laughter. Despite the disaster, the pie is awarded the highest honor for unexpected innovation in culinary disaster. Historically speaking, pies have long been the aristocratic equivalent of a political press release, full of hot air, designed to impress, but often leaving everyone wondering what just happened. So, what's the lesson here in pie form? Always expect the unexpected, especially when your successor to the culinary throne is a bird with impeccable timing and questionable aim. Remember, kindness may fill the heart, but it won't save your pie from a mud bath. Picture this Rome, 79 AD. The air is thick with the scent of burning Titus ashes and desperate optimism. The sun blazes down on the bustling forum, where merchants shout prices for anything from garum sauce to dubious olive oil, and nobles parade in their togas with the flair of cats avoiding water. Enter our protagonist, Gaius Saucilius, an ambitious chef whose latest culinary obsession is to fuse the exotic spice trade with traditional Roman cookery to create, brace yourself, the first ever chili con carne. Sounds revolutionary? Indeed. Sounds like a disaster brewing in a clay pot? Even better. The scene is set in a cramped kitchen behind the insulae, where the lighting is a suspicious mix of flickering oil lamps and the occasional flame caused by a careless servant. The smell is a pungent cocktail of fermented fish, smoky wood, and the impending doom of overspiced legumes. Gaius, sporting a tunica that has seen better days, and a confidence not unlike a rooster in a barnyard full of snakes, is stirring a massive cauldron filled with ingredients that the plebs would later describe as edible torture. As daylight fades, whispers begin to snake through the marketplace about the mysterious new dish. Roman culinary tradition is grounded in moderation, balance, and, most importantly, the art of not setting your tongue on fire. Legend has it that Roman etiquette decreed any meal too spicy to provoke tears was not just unlucky, but possibly an omen from the gods, particularly Vulcan, who apparently dislikes tears unless they come from forged swords. This belief sparked an urgent ritual. Each attempt at the chili con carne had to be blessed by the local augur, who, after sniffing the boiling pot, recommended sacrificing a roasted dormouse to appease the fiery spirits. Tension mounts. Nobles, curious and cautious, volunteer as taste testers, but often withdraw with dramatic hand gestures and complaints of their mouths feeling like the underworld itself. Meanwhile, Gaius, undeterred, introduces increasingly exotic spices smuggled from the East, believing that true greatness requires not just taste but endurance. His kitchen evolves into a theater of chaos, slaves fanning away smoke, cooks arguing over ingredients, and an unfortunate sous chef desperately fanning a flaming floor mat. Finally, the grand unveiling arrives. Amid cheers and skepticism, the chili is served. The first noble takes a tentative bite. His face contorts into what can only be described as a Roman sculpture of agony. He reaches for wine, then water, then anything throwable. The crowd gasps. Murmurs multiply. What had started as culinary innovation spirals into a near-religious crisis. Was it punishment, divine retribution, or did someone simply confuse red pepper flakes with volcanic ash? In a twist befitting this culinary catastrophe, it turns out the real culprit was N039T, the spices but a mischievous slave who had added an extra handful of peppercorns to plot a practical joke. The slaves, far from passive victims, celebrated this minor rebellion with sardonic laughter and a new nickname for Gaius: the Scorcher of the Palate. Historically speaking, while the Romans famously embraced sophisticated cuisine, they wisely kept their spice tolerance moderate. Chili peppers, wooden 039, arrive in Europe for another 14 centuries. So our fiery tale is part legend, part cheeky exaggeration, and entirely in the spirit of culinary hubris. So what have we learned from Gaius 039 Gourmet Gambit? When in Rome, do as the Romans do, and maybe leave the chili peppers to the future. Because if your culinary ambition requires... Picture this. Early morning, 1615, a tavern on the outskirts of London smelling faintly of stale ale, poor hygiene, and an ambitious culinary experiment gone awry. The year's highlight, if by highlight you mean a disaster that would haunt historians and condiment enthusiasts alike, was the Great Mustard Massacre. Yes, mustard. That humble, innocent paste that today barely raises an eyebrow, but back then caused more chaos than a royal scandal. The air was dim, with flickering candlelight casting jittery shadows across the wooden beams. The low murmur of patrons, the clink of tankards, and the occasional burp set the soundtrack. Center stage was a large barrel labeled the Grand Mustard Reserve, sludge-like and pungent enough to clear the sinuses of a long-dead executioner. Key characters included Master Tobin, the local spice merchant with a suspiciously twitchy eye, and Margaret, the tavern maid whose enthusiasm for kitchen experiments was only matched by her lack of culinary expertise. This wasn't just any mustard. This was a concoction combining horseradish, vinegar, fiery pepper, and a secret ingredient rumored to be ground-up dragon scales. In truth, probably just overzealous horseradish. The tension grew as patrons were encouraged, under threat of mild ridicule, to sample this fire-breathing condiment. Superstitions abounded. Some swore mustard could ward off plague spirits if consumed in exact tonics. Others whispered that too much would cause the soul to leave the body temporarily, a belief that conveniently explained any drunken, pass-it-out messes. Rituals included a solemn pre-tasting chant led by the oldest regular, who everyone agreed smelled faintly of expired cheese, invoking the blessing of the grain gods. Meanwhile, Margaret poured generous dollops into questionable stews, turning meals into perilous taste tests. Chaos erupted when a particularly robust version of the mustard was served during a local gentleman's card game. As the fiery droplets hit tongues, faces contorted into expressions oscillating between pain, disbelief, and the desperate hope it was just indigestion. One nobleman's monocle exploded a trademark casualty, and accusations flew that Master Tobin had deliberately spiked the batch to embarrass a rival. The culmination was a grand spectacle. Several patrons rushed outside, gasping for fresh air, while a dog, presumably brave or simply confused, voraciously devoured the leftover concoction and promptly fainted. The tavern's reputation suffered, and mustard was henceforth regarded with a mix of awe and fear. Historically, mustard has been both loved and feared, dating back to Roman times when it was considered a cure-all and a weapon of questionable use. Our mustard massacre fits nicely into the timeline of human culinary misadventure, where curiosity often leads to indigestion. So what's the takeaway? If you ever hear about a condiment causing a near eye, just remember, kindness may be gentle, but mustard, picture it. Dover, England, 1642. In the middle of a culinary crisis so severe, it makes modern-day gluten sensitivity look like a mild inconvenience. The coastal town is buzzing, but not with seagulls, with rumors of a mysterious disappearance, an event that would unset the most seasoned purveyor of baked goods. It's dawn. The fog is thick enough to knit into scarves, and the smell of freshly baked bread should be comforting. Instead, it's suspiciously absent. The town square, usually bustling with the delightful chaos of bakeries hawking crusty loaves, feels oddly quiet, save for the clacking of wooden clogs against cobblestone and the occasional startled gasp from a merchant discovering her larder is less full than last night. Enter our key players. Mistress Abby, the hawk-eyed flour merchant, troubled by quantities of flour behaving like magic, vanishing overnight. Young Tom, apprentice baker, whose hands are as skilled at kneading dough as they are at creating uproar, and a basket of the finest rye bread, the coveted prize in this carb conspiracy. The atmosphere is as tense as a teapot left on the boil too long. Dim morning light struggles to penetrate the thick mist, the air fragrant with the ghost of yeast and a hint of desperation. The sharp clink of wooden boards and the low murmurs of frightened townsfolk create an unsettling soundtrack. Whispers swirl about secret midnight gatherings where bread is not shared but smuggled, hoarded like gold. Some swear they hear the munching of looted loaves behind closed doors or see flour sacks suspiciously lighter, as if a bread bandit roams under the cover of darkness. What follows is a series of absurd rituals designed to protect the bread. Flour sacks guarded by watchmen, armed with nothing but rolling pins and suspicious glares. Bread deliveries accompanied by cryptic codes shouted across narrow alleys, and a bizarre superstition that bread thieves are cursed to suffer eternal indigestion. Town criers announce rewards not for the capture of bandits, but for any crumb of information, leading to increasingly irrelevant and comedic confessions. But then, the twist. The missing bread is discovered not stolen, but eaten, by the town's own posse of gluttonous rats who had been rehearsing their own version of a yeast revolution beneath the streets. The rats, it seems, preferred the finer things in life to the usual scraps, and had formed a covert syndicate, munching through reserves with such precision that suspicion couldn't quite settle on them. Historically, urban rodent populations have often played unwitting roles in community crises. Yet, this lavish critique of the bread crisis slyly hints at the unintended consequences of human paranoia. How fear can lead to watching the wrong shadows and unleashing an overabundance of rolling pins on innocent flour sacks. So, what's the moral of our carb thriller? Never underestimate a rat's appetite for rebellion, and if your bread goes missing, check your rodent syndicates before accusing your neighbors. After all, in the grand bakery of life, it's picture this. Jerusalem, circa 33 AD. Mid-afternoon heat, baking the dusty streets, and the unmistakable aroma of freshly baked bread wafting through the air. a smell so divine it could make even the most skeptical Roman pause and reconsider allegiance. Now, insert our unsuspecting hero. A traveler whose poor luck rivals a soap opera character, currently nursing wounds that look suspiciously like he lost a fight with a donkey. And central to this unfolding drama, a humble loaf of bread, slightly squished, but at the heart of a biblical brouhaha, gripping the region more than any invasive empire or tax collector ever could. The light isn't just golden. It's practically a solar spotlight illuminating every crumb that falls from the protagonist's torn tunic. Around him, vendors shout over each other selling olives and figs, their voices mingling with the clatter of sandals and distant temple chants. The air is thick with the scents of spiced incense and stale sweat. Jerusalem's original mixology. Here enters the parade of characters. A priest prancing by with an air of holier-than-thou. A Levite whose nose is evidently too high to stoop, and our Good Samaritan, who, despite social taboos thicker than the city walls, chooses kindness over convenience. Ah, but hold your applause. The bread, poor, innocent bread, is the fulcrum of a surprisingly complex social schism. Why? Because sharing food in those times wasn't just about calories. It was political theater, a diplomatic minefield, and a recipe for scandal. Was that crust contaminated by a Pharisee? Did it carry the unclean touch of a Samaritan? Bread, in this context, was less about sustenance and more about signaling who you were and who you weren't. Before our Samaritan even bandages that mangled traveler, there's an invisible tension, as thick as hummus spread too generously on a pita. Superstitions flutter around like dust motes. Eating with the wrong hand could doom you to 7 years of bad luck, and heaven forbid you pass food to a rival tribe unless you want to ignite a border skirmish. Just as our Samaritan dips into his bundle and offers a piece of that slightly crushed bread, the observers brace for an outcry, a scandal, maybe even a small war declared over a meal. But the miracle. The traveler accepts it without hesitation, crumbs dropping onto the dusty ground like tiny truce flags. Turns out, bread wasn't just breaking empires that day. It was mending human hearts. Even if, historically, the actual loaf likely tasted like a stale brick. In fact, bread itself holds a fascinating history as a symbol of life, division, and reconciliation. Something our ancient ancestors understood better than modern diplomats armed with briefcases and bottled water. So, our takeaway? When in doubt, break bread, preferably with someone who never imagined you'd share a meal. And remember, kindness might just be the yeasty ingredient needed to rise above ancient prejudices. Cue the opening scene. Dusty Judean road. About noon in the year who knows when BCE, but definitely before mobile phone signals existed. The sun blazes mercilessly, birds lazily circle overhead, and in the distance, a disheveled traveler lies sprawled next to the roadside. All very dramatic, except for the faint smell of overcooked barley porridge wafting from a suspiciously nearby campfire. Enter the Good Samaritan. Not the sort you expect in ancient times. He sports a questionable hat and wields a walking stick that doubles as a makeshift spork. Crucially, he carries under his arm a loaf of bread worth more respect than most subjects' lives. The scene is bathed in harsh sunlight, casting exaggerated shadows that seem to narrate their own sarcastic commentary. The air buzzes faintly with the grumbles of nearby merchants bargaining over goats and gallons of olive oil, the distinct crackle of dry leaves underfoot, and the occasional distant bleat of what must be the grumpiest sheep in all Judea. The key players are simple. The victim, the passers-by, each with a social excuse to skip charity, and our polite, butte, utterly unexpected Samaritan, uneasy but ready to perform a kindness so radical it might just upset centuries of social norms. Central to this story is not just human kindness, but a rather notoriously crusty loaf of bread, a common staple but here elevated to the status of symbolic sustenance and practical bandage because blood and bread stick strangely well. The bread's fate is the linchpin holding together a narrative that somehow manages to intertwine ethics, geography, and indigestion into one neat, if slightly awkward, package. Tension mounts with the arrival of the religious authorities, who eye the Samaritan's bread with suspicion, not because it's aged to a mild level of hardness, but because it comes from someone whose ancestry and hospitality reputations are deeply suspect. Strict dietary laws and social ostracism combine, giving the loaf an almost mythic aura of danger. Ritual hand-washing ceremonies are recalled with exaggerated precision, enough to rival modern-day hand sanitizer infomercials. Meanwhile, the Samaritan's offers to share his meager bread are met with stare-downs and incredulous murmurs. The social codes are far more tangled than a shepherd's rope after a particularly confusing day. Plot twist. When the Samaritan finally breaks the bread and offers it, the victim, initially thought to be beyond hope, perks up not due to divine intervention but because of an unexpected influx of serotonin triggered by the taste of surprisingly fresh, if slightly crumbly, bread. The religious authorities pause mid-scowl, as if realizing that perhaps kindness and carbohydrates had more to offer than they'd assumed. And, lo, the road becomes less bleak, conversations spark, and for a fleeting moment, societal divides soften, thanks to the power of stale bread and spontaneous generosity. Historically, bread has indeed been a linchpin of social interaction and survival, but the idea of a good Samaritan lending a hand, or a loaf, has morphed into a metaphor equally useful to preachers, poets, and politicians. This narrative cleverly exposes the absurdity of social divisions disguised as moral imperatives, and all thanks to a humble, starch-based treat. So what's the takeaway here? When life knocks you down beside an ancient highway, don't just wait for sympathy. Look for someone with bread, because nothing says compassion quite like breaking socially enforced bread, even if it's a bit stale and possibly a little dusty. Remember, kindness is best served warmed with a side of sarcasm, and always, always shared liberally. Picture a bustling medieval market square at the ungodly hour of daybreak, circa 14th century Europe. The air thick with the aroma of fresh manure and questionable hygiene, and the culprit of nervous twitching among townsfolk, a literal loaf of bread. Yes, the simple staple that would ignite a scramble more dramatic than any joust or sermon. Under flickering torchlight, merchants haggle with the fervor of gladiators, and peasants edge closer with hopeful eyes under the watchful gaze of a few overly zealous town guards who suspect everyone of plotting to steal the last stale crust. The scene unfolds against a backdrop of muddy cobblestones, smeared inexplicably with spilled ale and the occasional rat conducting an indifferent inspection. Enter our key players. The starved peasant whose belly sounds like a distant thunderstorm, the gleeful merchant clutching the prized barley loaf, and the nobleman just arrived from his castle, mistaking this chaos for some quaint form of public entertainment. It's not just any bread on the chopping block. It's the king's own bread, blessed, or so its sellers claim during the last royal harvest festival, imbued with a blessing that allegedly bestows kindness upon those who partake, which makes its scarcity all the more tragic and ironic. The absurdity. Town laws decree that you must first perform a ritualistic dance, somewhere between a jig and a desperate weed whack, before being allowed to buy said bread. This dance supposedly wards off any theft attempts by confusing the spirits of greed, or so the town elders insist during every town meeting where no one pays attention. Add to this the superstition that anyone who consumes the bread without first sharing a piece with a neighbor risks being cursed with chronic bad luck, evidenced by tales of barn collapses and livestock mysteriously disappearing. Our nobleman scoffs openly at these warnings, mocking the peasants as he pockets extra loaves for his dogs, unknowingly sowing the seeds of his impending comeuppance. Amid mounting tension, the peasant surprisingly finds a crumb fallen from the merchant's bundle, and, in a moment of divine irony, pockets it just before the feisty merchant launches into accusations of loaf larceny. Chaos ensues. Laughter mixes with accusations, and the dance-off turns into a full-on bread brawl with all participants slipping, sliding, and vying for the last crumb. The twist? Just as the nobleman attempts to smugly exit stage left with his ill-gotten bread, he trips over an uprooted cobblestone, cursed, the villagers claim, and face-plants into the muddy mess he mocked. The crowd erupts, not with scorn but with a rare, genuine cheer, thrilled by this poetic justice dressed in pastry. Historically, while medieval bread wasn't always the stuff of legends, it was indeed a critical currency of kindness and survival. Yet, more often, a breadless citizen was just a hungry one with a bad attitude. Superstitions aside, sharing bread did foster communal bonds, offering an unintentional lesson in kindness that could outlast a viral plague or two. So, what have we learned from the crumbly chaos? When the loaf looks divine but the rules demand a dance, maybe kindness isn't about fancy blessings or rituals but the ridiculous, often muddy shared moments. And maybe, just maybe, watch your footing before you mock the locals. Picture this. Somewhere along the dusty, rugged roads of ancient Judea, approximately 30 AD, a traveler attempts to make his way through the kind of territory where hospitality was as rare as a well-made road and twice as perilous. The sun beats down mercilessly. The air is thick with the scent of crushed spices and fearful anticipation. And our hapless hero clutches not gold, nor jewels, but something far more controversial, a jar of homemade pickles. These are no ordinary pickles, mind you. They are cucumbers cured in a vinegar concoction so secret and so suspicious that even the local Pharisees would raise an eyebrow and murmur prayers of caution. The pickle, stained faint green with wild herbs plucked from forbidden gardens, sits provocatively in the traveler's satchel, radiating a pungency that challenges the very fabric of neighborly trust. Around him, the road is a cacophony of clamor, traders haggling over camel prices, sheep bleating their existential dread, and somewhere in the distance a bandit, humming a suspiciously melodic tune that may or may not be a threat. Now, the tension isn't just about who might swipe the pickles, it's about what those pickles represent. In the annals of early hospitality disputes, fermented vegetables carry a disproportionate amount of cultural paranoia. Think less sharing is caring, and more sharing is suspicious, especially if it's pickled. The unspoken rules of rural Judean etiquette dictated that offering food to a stranger was either an act of divine kindness or a cleverly disguised gut punch. Rituals surrounding the pickles included a dubious series of sniff tests, allegedly passed down from desert nomads who swore by the mystical power of discerning good vinegar from bad. Some travelers even carried talismanic jars inscribed with prayers against evil digestion, because nothing ruins a journey faster than demonic intestinal betrayal. Our traveler, despite the growing murmurs and sideways glances, does the unthinkable. He offers a single pickle to a wounded man lying by the roadside, a form of kindness so radical it would later inspire an entire parable and a lifetime of suspicious neighbors. But here's the twist. The wounded man, initially suspicious, takes the pickle and finds it surprisingly delicious. The pickle's sour punch revives not just the body, but the communal spirit, momentarily dissolving the centuries-old distrust baked into the region's culinary customs. Historical context, if you must. Fermented foods were survival staples, yet they occupied an odd space of reverence and fear. The Good Samaritan's pickle sharing was revolutionary, not just socially, but gastronomically. The moral of this bizarre pickle saga? If you wander ancient roads with a jar of questionable vegetables, remember, kindness sometimes tastes like vinegar, and the road to salvation might imagine Jerusalem. 33 AD, the dusty road stretches out under a blistering sun, where locals, donkeys, and the occasional overly ambitious camel share a not-so-intimate relationship with the hustle and bustle of ancient travel. Somewhere between a sheep bleating its protest and a merchant loudly hawking olive oil with the enthusiasm of a town crier on caffeine, a loaf of humble bread becomes the focal point of an impending historical melodrama. The air is thick with the warm aroma of freshly baked barley bread, mingled with the less appetizing but equally omnipresent scent of sweat, dust, and something vaguely reminiscent of goat. Our key players: a beaten and broken traveler lying on the side of the road, spoiler. No one's rushing to help. A priest passing by with a face that screams I have places to be, and a Samaritan, whose reputation for goodwill is about as popular as unsolicited advice. This bread isn't your everyday carb, it's the ancient equivalent of a peace treaty wrapped in crust. Sharp-eyed merchants whisper that whoever controls the loaf controls the pilgrims' stomachs, and by extension, a surprising chunk of local power. The bread's rustic crust hides a softer interior, like the whole situation. Deceptively simple, but riddled with complexities. Now enter the absurdity. The priest avoids the man, not because of indifference, but because ancient laws warned against ritual impurity, especially near the unclean. The Levite, the original side-eye specialist, glances at his sandals as if the man might literally sprout something contagious. Meanwhile, the Samaritan, often the punchline in Judea's ethnic tiff, decides to risk not only germs but questionable social backlash and actual coin to help. Rituals were taken very seriously back then. Washing hands twice before eating, Not touching certain animals, and the odd custom of avoiding anyone who resembled an ancient version of a walking disaster area meant kindness was often sidelined for self-preservation. The tension builds as the Samaritan cleans wounds with wine and oil. Improvised first aid that doubles as a luxury spa treatment. Townsfolk gossip about how scandalous it is to fraternize across these ancient social boundaries. All while the unfortunate traveler wonders if he just signed up for a medieval episode of Extreme Makeover, Roadside Edition. And the twist? This Samaritan doesn't just stop at bandaging and bedside manner, he shoves the guy onto his donkey, because who needs a limo, and takes him to the inn, promising to cover any extra expenses. A gesture so revolutionary that it basically rewrites the book on neighborly love and probably ruins a few assumptions about who's supposed to hate whom. Historically speaking, the Good Samaritan parable wasn't just a nicety. It was a cheeky social commentary during a time when ethnic tensions were as common as dusty sandals. It wittily challenges the rigid boundaries of kindness and neighborliness with one simple, albeit crusty, loaf of bread. So, what's the takeaway from this archaic roadside drama? Always be the Samaritan, mostly because doing the decent thing might just involve getting your hands dirty, risking social faux pas, and maybe lending your donkey. In other words, kindness isn't always clean or convenient, but it's definitely worth the crumbs. Picture this. Rome, circa 44 BC. The city buzzing louder than a toga party on election night. The forum is packed, the air thick with the scent of sweat, ambition, and just a hint of unwashed sandals. And smack dab in the middle of it all is the humble loaf of bread. Yes, bread, because in ancient Rome, nothing says politics like a crusty carbohydrate. The sun dips low, casting dramatic shadows over marble statues that have seen more backstabbing than a gladiator's knife. Vendors shout, gladiators flex. Senators murmur plots over goblets of wine. And somewhere, a poet is desperately trying to rhyme empire with desire. Amid this chaos stands Gaius Crustum, a man best known for two things: his unmatched ability to eat an entire loaf of bread in under a minute, and his insatiable hunger for power. But tonight isn't about Gaius's eating prowess. It's about the great bread crisis of 44 BC. You see, bread was no ordinary foodstuff. It was a political instrument, a social glue, and the ultimate crowd pleaser. But when the flour shipments started arriving late, the ovens cooled, and the hungry masses grumbled louder than a Senate debate on tax reform. Roman bakers, who considered themselves the true unsung heroes of the Republic, began to perform ritual sacrifices to Ceres, the goddess of grain, involving elaborate ceremonies where they chanted incantations like "Rise, yeast, rise," and occasionally waved their spatulas toward suspicious alms collectors. This wasn't just superstition. It was desperation baked right into the crust. Meanwhile, the Senate scrambled to calm the public, proposing everything from free olive oil rations to impromptu chariot races, essentially bribing the populace with what we'd call today bread and circuses. But when the loaves ran out, the crowds turned from mildly annoyed to oaths. "Oh my God!" throwing rotten figs like fiery missiles and chanting for scapegoats. Enter Marcus, the streetwise plebeian known for turning anything into a political statement, including breadcrumbs. he organized the first-ever bread riot, armed with nothing but stale loaves and a wicked sense of irony. The Senate panicked, the consuls fled their marble offices, and the bakers stockpiled ingredients in underground flour vaults guarded by suspiciously grumpy geese. Just when it all seemed poised to crumble like a poorly made focaccia, a mysterious stranger appeared offering a solution so radical it involved sharing bread rather than hoarding it. This act of kindness and common sense shocked the aristocracy, who preferred their bread served with a side of power and paranoia. The twist? That stranger was nobody else but Julius Caesar himself, who used the bread crisis to cement his popularity, proving once and for all that nothing unites a people like feeding them, preferably before the next assassination. Historically speaking, the phrase bread and circuses coined by the Roman poet Juvenal was more than just a cliché. It was a survival strategy in a republic balancing on the edge of empire and anarchy. So what's the moral of this slice of history? Never underestimate the power of a loaf. It can build empires, topple senators, and inspire revolutions. And if you're ever running for office, remember, keep the bread fresh and the circuses even fresher. Otherwise, you might find yourself on the wrong side of a republic as the credits roll on our whimsical journey through the past few hours. It's time to reflect on a few important lessons that, like a cat with 9 lives, have led us back to the beginning. Humanity has long deluded itself into believing we wield the reins of control over animals. We pat ourselves on the back for our advancements in training goldfish to perform synchronized swimming and teach parrots to recite Shakespeare, all the while ignoring the fact that our canine companions might just be biding their time, plotting their revenge for being forced to wear silly costumes. Ah yes, a society where we classify creatures as pets, yet unwittingly awaken their primal urge for vengeance, which has threaded its way through history like an unruly house cat over a freshly printed newspaper. Let us not forget the great chicken uprising of 1870 when flocks rose up against their oppressive farmers, demanding better treatment and the freedom to roam as proud symbols of poultry. Who can overlook the infamous Pigeon Rebellion of 1923, which sent a clear message that breadcrumbs are no substitute for dignity? These cobblestone moments in history show us that the animals we wish to control have, quite comically, been planning carefully orchestrated strikes against us for ages. Now, if you thought Fido was earnestly following your commands, buckle up. Perhaps he's actually just winding up for a demonstration of how quickly he can turn a bluebird into a feather duster. In this theater of the absurd, as we tuck ourselves into bed tonight, let us remember this final piece of wisdom. If the dog isn't wagging his tail in delight, there's a chance he's simply winding up for the almighty leap onto your unsuspecting lap, ready to unleash the chaos he has contained. So, when you wake in the morning, remember, kindness to strangers is one thing, but treating our furry companions with respect is another ballgame, even if they're just trying to train us. And as we bid adieu to this satirical examination of unexpected compassion, remember, beware the dog that has mastered the art of the innocent gaze. It's not just practicing its acting skills, it's plotting a comeback worthy of the ages.